explaining the immigration integration attitude in Japan through higher education. So now you have like a short introduction, or you can just comment. It's fine. The family is actually attending from Canada. She's like 3 a.m. right now, so hopefully she can attend until the end. But forgive us if she's going to bed or something. But I'll be here until the end. So okay, I'm gonna start to share the screen and to present our exciting working project to you. Okay, can everyone see the slide? So our project, the title of our working project is called Can University Education Cultivate Immigration Integration, the case of local enfranchisement for foreign residents in Japan. So our motivation starts from the following pre-existing evidence and the question. So in the previous studies of political science on immigration attitude, there's a consistent evidence of correlation between higher education and liberal immigration attitude, which means that more educated people have more liberal or attitude towards immigrants. Well, this evidence is mixed on their causal connections, as some studies argue that education might be caused by some relevant factor that's also causing liberal immigration attitude. So there's some discussion regarding whether education is causing liberal immigration attitude really, but the evidence in the pre-existing study shows that there is some relationship with higher education and liberal immigration attitude. On the other hand, this existing evidence is largely based on North America and Europe. And this is not surprising, given that these are the popular immigrant destination these days for these like many years. On the however, but some Asian countries like Japan has been also a popular destination for immigrants in recent days. So our question is motivation is simple, in that can current evidence that is found in North America and Europe mostly hold in Japan? So given the motivation here, I just want to review a quick background on the immigration situation, the issue of immigration in Japan. So for these several years, recently, Japan is promoting immigrants admission to increase the number of immigrants to coming into Japan. On the other hand, it is known that these policies does not come in tandem with their integration policies that to basically to make them become a part of the Japanese society. So they are considered more as a temporal, non-long-term workers. For example, in MIPX, which is the integration index that is measured across countries, Japan scores low on measure of long-term pathways, ensuring the long-term pathways to becoming a permanent part of the society, which is indicating getting a citizenship itself. And also, Japan does not grant voting rights to permanent residents, foreigners at any level of elections. The only exception here is that Japan allows local suffrage in referendum at the local government level, but the referendum at the local government level in Japan does not have any legal authority over any policy decisions. So technically, there is no the foreigners, even if they are permanent residents, have no way for now to influence their preferences, reflect their preferences on Japanese politics. And there's a rising discussion for decades regarding whether these voting rights, especially for the issue of voting rights, should be given to permanent residents in Japan. And there are some variations in opinion across Japanese people. Our question here is that does the university education increase the support for foreigners' voting rights in Japan as found in other countries in North America and Europe? Just a few more details about the voting rights issue, the foreigners' voting rights issue in Japan. Historically, Zainichi Koreans or the Koreans in Japan who many of them hold what is called a special permanent resident status, part of the permanent resident status, that they demand voting rights for permanent residents in Japan. These people are actually came to Japan at the time before the World War II, where Japan Japan controls the what is now a Korean territory, as in the before World War II. So they had more mobility and incentive to come to Japan. And those people stayed in Japan even after the World War II, but they didn't become Japanese citizens because they're originally from Korean Peninsula. And so there's a long-term movement regarding granting of voting rights to these foreigners or permanent residents in Japan. But there's a strong concern from the conservative politician in Japan that granting voting rights to them, that they may betray the Japanese national interest if they can participate in Japanese politics. Also, in the recent days, there are an increasing number of Chinese people becoming part of Japanese society, coming to Japan as an immigrant, and Chinese is now taking over Korean as the largest foreign group, and they also form a largest group of regular permanent residents, which is not special, but so in the population permanent residents, Koreans and the Chinese are two largest groups of concern in Japan today. Let's turn to the role of university education in Japan and elsewhere. So our argument here is that the kind of logic found in North America and Europe regarding the role of university education in changing immigration attitude may or may not work, or may or may not persist in Japan. So in North America and Europe, we saw that there are three major potential mechanisms that people expect the university to play in terms of changing the attitude towards immigrants. So one of them could be that the university professors tend to be liberal in society, in the Western society, so that they pass on the liberal views to students so that to liberalize the students. So those who are attending universities, they're kind of meeting these professors who are liberal, and they turn to more liberal. That's one of the kind of mechanisms proposed. Another mechanism is about the learning pedagogy, that to focus more on the process of thinking than the outcomes. That makes people to think more deeply and carefully about the attitude themselves, and tend to make their opinion more open-minded and liberal than make it conservative and stick to the current state. The third mechanism could be that the university provides the opportunities for positive social contact with foreigners. That means that when you're attending university, you are meeting exchange students or foreigner students from many other countries. That is not possible until high school, so that you have more opportunity to actually meet people from foreign countries and develop some positive feeling towards them. That makes in turn, that changes the immigration attitude. So given that these mechanisms are kind of proposed in the North America and Europe and seems to work okay, how about in Japan? First, we argue that for the first mechanism, the university professor being liberal is potentially weaker. That to our knowledge, there's no strong evidence that Japanese university professors are more liberal than other people in occupation in Japan. That means even if it's conventional in North American Europe to say that professors are more liberal, Japan, it may not be the case. Also, learning pedagogy mechanism we're also expecting to be weaker. That it is frequently argued in the kind of Japanese education literature that Japanese university education tend to have less focus on learning process rather than outcomes, so that this pedagogy mechanism may be weaker at place in Japanese university. For the third mechanism, that university provides a social contact with the foreigners. We argue that this mechanism could be potentially gendered in Japan. So there are like unequal distribution of exchange of foreign students in different fields of studies in universities. For example, you see more foreign students in like social science or humanities field or communication field than other fields like natural sciences or engineering in general. And that's the case in Japan. But this unequal distribution of exchange students is correlated with the unequal distribution of gender in these fields in Japan, that in Japan, the social science and humanities fields are more frequently chosen by female students than the male students. So given that knowledge, we expect that these positive social contact mechanism may be stronger or among females, but weaker among males. Given discussion, we have five hypotheses, but 1, 2, 3. The third hypothesis is 3 for study. First, given that we have gendered expectation for the mechanisms, we expect the male university students to have higher support for granting suffrage to permanent resident foreigners compared to non-university attendees. For females, we do expect that the university education increase the support for granting suffrage to permanent resident foreigners. So we have a separate hypothesis for male and female. And regarding the mechanism, we are thinking about what is called the mediation. So how university education's effect is mediated by different factors. The first and second row of the previous table indicates that Japanese university may play a weaker role in liberalizing the students' view on the political views. So that in A3A, the third hypothesis, we expect that education's effect on these granting permanent, the voting suffrage to permanent residents is not mediated by the liberalization of ideology. So in university mediation, even if they change their mediation attitude, these effects may not be mediated through the liberalization of ideology. On the other hand, the social contact mechanism may be still at work in Japan, which we argue that education's effect is mediated by more positive feeling towards Koreans and Chinese that are two major population of permanent residents in Japan. Now I'm turn to describing the data we use to analyze such hypotheses. We have two data sets to be used. The first data set is called the Survey on the Image of Foreign Countries and Current Topics. That is conducted in Japan, which is a monthly online survey that they sample approximately 2,000 respondents every month from 2011 October through 2013 September. So we have a gigantic data set with a sample of around 50,000 respondents in total every time with the fresh Japanese samples. In addition to these big data characteristics, this data asks respondents to provide a zip code of their residential address voluntarily, and majority of respondents, they do give zip codes so that we know approximately where the respondents live in a Japanese kind of geography. I'm going to discuss more later that why this variable is important in our analysis. The second survey, which we use to kind of validate the finding on the first survey, is called the U-Tokyo Asahi survey. It's a University of Tokyo Asahi survey, which is a mail election survey with Japanese samples conducted in 2009, 2012, and 2014, which are the year that where the Japanese national election was happening. The reason why we use this survey as a second data set is that this survey was conducted by mail questionnaire, which is very different from the online method. So they are getting different kinds of samples that cannot be reached by the online survey, especially like older population or with some other characteristics. In total, we had a sample of around 4,000 for this survey. In terms of measuring the variable, both survey has a similar set of variables. I'm just going to explain it together. Our outcome variable is measured as the support for granting local suffrage to permanent residents in Japan. The original variable is in categorical, but we, for the simplicity of the analysis, we converted the value into 1 agree and 0 neither or disagree. So we have a binary outcome variable. Our independent variable of interest is university education, which indicates 1 as having undergraduate degree or more, the higher, or 0 having a high school or less degree. There are some respondents who are having a degree in between, somewhere like a 2-year college or vocational school. Since we don't have a good theoretical explanation, expectation regarding how these in-between variables are going to affect, these respondents are excluded from the analysis for now. In terms of mediators to test these mediating hypotheses in H3, we have three variables, which is first, it's a self-identified ideology that people, the respondents are asked to self-identify whether they are left or right. And also, we have a variable for feeling towards South Korea. So they are asked to rate how warm they're feeling they have towards South Korea or China. All these mediators scored rescaled into the 0-1 range. So they score from the minimum value 0 to maximum value 1. In all the following analysis, we also have a control variables or confounders that are knowledge, political knowledge, political interest, either they are employed or not, their economic evaluations, that if they have positive economic evaluation, they tend to be more positive to immigrants. That's the expectation here. Higher income, and also the time of the survey, the fixed effects for the time of the survey, survey weights or years in the second data set case. Now we're going to the analysis part. So I want to show you the results we get. The first set of the results is shown here. So since the outcome variable is a binary variable, we run a logistic regression model to estimate the effect of education on the support for the granting local suffrage to permanent residents. Points and bars represents the odds ratio or the coefficients, exponentiated coefficients of the logistic regression. If this the point is higher than the value 1.0, that means that the education has a positive effect on this local granting local suffrage support. If it's at the left or lower than 1.0, then it's a negative effect. And these bars represents the confidence interval for the estimate. And if this bar crosses this one line, the effect is not statistically significant. And if it does not crosses the one, then the effect is statistically significant. The green estimates are for the first data set, the SIFCCT, and the second, the orange estimates are for the University of Tokyo Asahi survey, UTAS. So we split the results by gender and age. And what we are seeing here is that in all these four panels, the only consistent evidence of education effect is seen on this top left panel, that in both data sets, the education effect is positive and statistically significant. That means that only among young females, there seems to be the effect of education to increase the support for granting suffrage to permanent residents. In other categories, for males, in any generations, the education has no statistically significant effect to increase the support for granting suffrage. For other generation female, middle age coefficients are weaker in general, and there's inconsistent evidence among elderly. Here, our note is that we are using, especially for the green estimate, the SIFCCT is using an online survey, which indicates that they might have a harder time collecting a representative sample in older generations. So our expectation is that we don't really put too much weight on this as a SIFCCT estimate for the older generation, which is particularly probably a special kind of people who can answer online survey while they are over 60s. While UTAS survey is supposed to be more representative, that they are sending males and using more representative sampling frame. So that this evidence, so that there is no consistent evidence that university education works to increase the support for granting suffrage among older generation. So given our evidence that this university education seems only work and valid to assess among the young generation, and we see the effect only among females, we go deeper into analysis by using a more sophisticated methodology to estimate the effect of education. So here, the usual, we are turning to a method called matching. In the conventional method of regression or logistic regression to estimate the causal effect, there's a problem that we are assuming some kind of parametric relationship or some kind of distribution of errors that are assumed when you're controlling for variables and else. The matching method is a method to alleviate such issues by trying to achieve the equation shown in here. So this equation shows that it's Px given t equal 1 equal the Px given t equal 0, which means that it's an empirical density of x, which is a confounder, given that the treatment is 1, or the treatment here is a university education. So university education, the empirical density of confounder given that the university education, we have a university education or not to have an education to be identical. Which means that we want to find a set of respondents that are having exactly or very similar value or distribution of values of confounders for being educated people and not being educated people. These match methods try to achieve this purpose by basically dropping out the data set, cutting out the data set by finding, for example, there are a lot of people. So in the data set for the younger cohort, we have a lot of people having a university education and fewer amount of people who are not having a university education. So we are cutting out the data set by first start with the minority people who are not having the university education and try to find for each these minority people that to match with the pair matching with the university educated people who have a similar characteristics as possible for the control variables. So this method is known as a non-parametric processing approach to filter away the influence of confounders. That kind of does not depend on the parametric assumption that's done in logistic regression or other regression approaches. Further, we have another tweak to this matching method that is called the geographic distance adjusted matching. The current method of matching does not allow using this geographic location. It's hard to use the geographic location of respondents to match pairs. So in this geographic distance adjusted matching, first we're going to match on the usual characteristics like demography, here knowledge, interest, employment, economic evaluation, income, and survey rates. But in addition to that, we are trying to match the pairs that is close as possible together, closest as possible together in terms of geographic location of the respondents. So I'm not going to talk too much detail in here, but the point here is that after adjusting for the geographic distance, we are trying to match the respondents who are having similar demographic characteristics as possible within some geographic distance range. To show how this works more intuitively, the left panel shows that our matching result with no distance adjustment. All these lines indicates the matched pairs of one being educated and another being not educated. And these two people, each pairs are similar as possible in terms of control variable to isolate the effect of education. But as you can see, when you are not considering the geographic distance between the samples, what happens is that these pairs are jumping around all over different areas of different locations of Japan. This is a map of Japan. so that it doesn't make sense kind of to say that these two people are similar, even if they are living in a very, very different area of Japan. And we also know that this geography matters, matters that, the different geographic environment have a different condition of immigrant situation or the education, so that this geographic environment have an impact on the formation of opinion. So we want to match those people in addition to the demographic characteristics that lives in a similar environment as possible. The distance adjusted matching does exactly so. That, for example, in this matching, we are matching the forcing every respondent to live within the 200 kilometers away each other, so that they are kind of matched within these local context. So after the matching, we estimate the same model as the previous one, and so that we have a robustness check of our results. So it turns out that among males, so this is again the logistic regression estimate. So among males, the effect is null altogether. That means that even after matching more sophisticated estimation of causal effect, there's no change in the null effect of education. Among females, the effect is getting slightly weaker, but still persisting. For some range, it is weak enough to kind of become marginally significant, but still, like, there are some positive effects. The last part of our analysis is for the causal mediation analysis. So in this analysis, we have three types of estimates. That the mediator analysis assumes that there is some mediation, like a mediator variable is mediating the effect of treatment with education on outcome, which is the preference towards the granting voting suffrage. So mediator is either ideology or feeling towards Korea in China. So we have three estimates from the method proposed by Imai et al. The first is the effect from the education to mediator, and second is the effect from mediator to the outcome, and the third effect is the overall effect of mediation. These are the current results for the ideology to start with. So these are the treatment to mediator effect. The center panel shows the mediator to outcome, which is ideology to the granting local suffrage. And the third panel shows our interest, which is the mediation effect. Whether the ideology is mediating the effect of education on granting local suffrage. As shown in the third panel, it is shown that there is no mediation effect whatsoever, that the confidence interval, as shown in Burr, crosses zero line for all estimates, whether not matching or with matching. It turns out the effect is null, mainly because there is no effect of education on ideology, which is what we discussed in the hypotheses. The second thing, second graph is for the South Korea, the feeling towards South Korea. The right panel shows that there is some mediation effect, that especially among females, that it is consistently shown that the education does have an effect on granting local suffrage to foreigners through improving the feeling towards South Koreans. These two panels at the left show that the education do have an effect on the feeling towards Korea among females, and education, the feeling towards Korea does have an effect over the outcome, which is granting local suffrage to foreigners. The effect is actually perceived similar among males, but the size of the effect is much weaker compared to females. The last analysis is parallel to feeling towards South Korea, but it's for China, the feeling towards China, which we actually found the no results. The result shows that the effect is statistically significant only when with the not matched sample. But after using a robustness check with the matching, it turns out that there's no mediation effect. And the reason why we didn't have a mediation effect is mainly because the education has no effect on improving the feeling towards Chinese, even if the feeling towards China do have an effect on the outcome, which is they granting a local suffrage to foreigners. Lastly, we're going to summarize the results and discuss the implications here. So our analysis suggests that Japanese education has a limited effect on integration attitudes at best. But if any, the effect is existing among the young cohort, existing among female, and also is mediating through feeling towards South Korea, not like ideology, liberal or conservative. Our evidence implies more nuanced and inclusive theory of how higher education shapes public opinion that can kind of contribute to the extension, development of theory that's originally found in North America and Europe. Our method of geographic distance adjustment to matching provides more robust inferences to causal effect. Some caveats to our analysis is that our analysis is limited to integration policy and limited to Japan, so we cannot immediately generalize our results to other countries yet. And there potentially, even if like we had some sophisticated method for causal inference, there could be some non-geographic factors of selection effects that might makes it difficult that might influence the result. Some future question we can ask, especially in terms of Japan, is that the first question is what is driving political beliefs, if not education? Our results indicate that education might not be a strong driving factor to change the political attitude of Japanese people. Then what are the kind of strongest predictors of these development of political views, if not education? Another question we're interested in asking in the future is that whether education have a differential effects in other types of ideological attitudes other than like immigration attitudes. So that's all for my presentation today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Gento. So we'll open up the questions. If you want to post maybe your name or the question in the chat room, and that way we can get the conversation going. Or if you just want to jump in, and does anyone have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kato, for your presentation. My question is related to the ideology. So, what was the conceptualization and operationalization of liberal ideology of Japanese professors? I think I missed that part, maybe.
Yeah, so it's difficult to define the liberal or conservative ideology. There are many ways to measure. So part of it is anecdotal in the sense that we didn't find any literature that's saying that university professors are more liberal in any sense. than other occupations. But we do find one study that measures try to measure the professor's ideology through their messages on the website, the university website, and they found that these messages are not exactly liberal on average, like liberal in terms of the policy views on average. Does it give you some clues?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I guess I had a follow-up question to that. I was, what evidence do we have that that we're comparing these comparable standards of liberalism? That so that the assumption seems to be that both of these higher educational systems are liberal, but so much of the Western tradition was the historical reality of these settler states, and of course the philosophical tradition of free movement. So this could be an antecedent variable. I mean, so does this kind of tradition exist in Japanese liberalism? And I guess as a follow-up, what about Japanese students that are educated in the West? Do they have similar kinds of, I mean, are they affected by Western educational institutions in a way that the Japanese who are educated in Japan aren't? So I guess I'll throw those out at you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's very interesting. So we didn't go really deep about the conceptualization of ideology. We are kind of interested in the ideology in the sense that it's a kind of a general construct that can influence the kind of more accepting and open-minded immigration attitudes. So I think it's a really good suggestion to go deeper on this conceptualization of ideology and whether its development in history is different in North America, Europe, and Japan. And I believe so in some extent, but I do not have an immediate answer for you for that. And for the second point about whether the Western educated Japanese people develops a similar view as Western students, do they develop a different view than the Japanese students who had a Japanese education? This is a very interesting question, and I think it was explored by itself. The answer is like, I don't really know, but maybe. It turns out that there are not very many Japanese students who are actually study in Western University from the start to the end. So we don't really know the data set that collects enough sample of Japanese students who learn in a Western education environment. So we don't really know for sure, but at least among those students who learn in Japan, this is my kind of impression. That I also don't have too much evidence, like in terms of quantitative data, but that many of these Japanese students who learn in Japanese higher education, they do not necessarily develop kind of liberal kind of ideas through learning in the education system. That's our impression, but this is a great suggestion, and we can probably explore some data set or something to ask these questions. Thanks.
I have a question, or it's kind of a set of comments. If you don't mind, I'll kind of ramble a little bit. So it seems in some ways, yeah, exactly, that this paper it's more about the liberalizing effect of Japanese education or not than it is about immigration or immigration attitudes. But I think that it's kind of pulling in two different directions in the paper. I mean, I didn't really read the paper carefully, but from your presentation, it seems like the theories are kind of pulling in two different directions. And I think, there actually is, what it might be interesting to compare. There is a small literature on attitudes towards immigration that exists outside of these Western countries, right? So I mean,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
the
you know,
idea is, and that might actually be interesting to compare, because you might find some different factors that it's not just education in certain cases. And so I think, like, for example, in the Russian case, there's some literature on this. They do find that kind of urbanization and population density might play a role, right? Because you have more immigrants in those areas. And so this is getting into like group contact, group threat sorts of theories that, you know, you would expect different things depending on people's contact with immigrants, not only necessarily in the education setting, but also in the overall setting, right? That this is going to be driving your explanation rather than simply the education effect. So it might be interesting to see, like, if you want to go the direction of immigration, attitudes towards immigrants, rather than the liberalizing effect of education, then you might want to explore that a little bit more theoretically, I think. Because but then if you're talking about integration, I actually find the paper is not really about integration, right? It's about it's about immigration attitudes, really. Though you could frame it as integration if you're talking about integration as like a two-way street, right? So integration is not only what we see immigrants doing, but it's also public reception, right? So if you want to talk about integration, that might be the way that you need to frame it, right? Because and integration is actually pretty complex, right? Because you're talking about one specific measure of integration that's specific, like a political type of integration. Whereas when we talk about integration on a larger, in a broader view, we're talking about kind of cultural integration and you know, kind of economic integration into the labor market, right? There's lots of different ways that we can integrate, that immigrants can integrate. So, I mean, those are all just kind of random thoughts coming from the immigration perspective, right? From the immigration literature perspective. I think there actually is a pretty developing literature on Japanese immigration and Southeast immigration, the politics of immigration, that I think might actually make the puzzle more interesting than just kind of contrasting Japan to Western immigration cases. There might be a more kind of a more interesting puzzle based on our expectations, because it's actually not really clear to me why if the Japanese education system isn't particularly liberal, that we would actually see this effect at all, right? So I think that there's probably some room to explore how to frame the puzzle a little bit more interesting. And then one final comment, and that is, so the elephant in the room to me is the ethnicity of immigrants, because in Japan, we have this sort of ethnically homogeneous immigration population, right? Or the aspiration for an ethnically homogeneous integration or immigration population. And you know, so you mentioned the Koreans, which I assume are ethnic Koreans, but you don't mention ethnic Japanese immigrants. And I think it seems like there should be an effect, right? It seems like it should matter who the immigrants are as to how people feel about them.
What do you mean by ethnic Japanese immigrants here? So
I mean, like the labor migration programs that were meant to attract like Brazilian Japanese back to Japan, right?
I see.
So things like that. And maybe those are those even considered to be immigrants? But it seems like that a lot of the immigration literature on Japan looks at that issue, and so it just seems to be. It's not addressed in your paper at all. I'm just curious how that might actually be, might affect your outcomes. That's all I'll say for now.
Yeah. Thanks for the comments. I think in terms of the framing, I think we're interested more on the kind of liberalizing effect of education in general, than like going deeper into this immigration attitudes determinants issue. That's interesting question by itself, and we know that these population density or like threat of immigrants in the presence of society has an effect on immigration attitudes. I think it's in any country, including like in Western. And like geographic business matching kind of method is kind of what we're trying to filter away such effect of like environment, residential environment influencing the immigration attitudes, so that we can isolate the education effect. I think I could explain it more clearly. And for the last your comment, just to mention about these Japanese ethnic Japanese immigrants coming to Japan. The one thing first is that Japan, technically, they don't accept any low-skilled workers into Japan today. So that any workers that coming into Japan, low-skilled workers coming into Japan, they call the trainees, that is defined as a kind of, not as a like the actual immigrants in low-skilled visa, like they are just a trainees that is supposed to be trained for a few years and they go back to the country. So all of them are basically a temporal workers in Japan, defined as, so they are not exactly a permanent resident. There's no path for them to become a permanent resident in Japan. So since our kind of dependent variable is talking about permanent residents, we didn't really talk about these too much about the temporal worker issue in Japan, which is also big recent days. So yeah, so I think it's very interesting, but it's not very relevant to the issue of giving a local voting suffrage to the permanent residents, because those people who are coming to Japan as workers in recent days had no way to become a permanent resident technically. And yeah, and also this is my impression, like kind of, but for the like, it is true that Japanese Brazilians or the Japanese Caribbean or these people having a kind of easier time coming to be successfully applied to these trainees and come to Japan. But my impression is that maybe they are not really considered as ethnic Japanese. Once they are coming to Japan, they are really be seen more as ethnically South American, compared to Japanese. So, so yeah, it could be a very interesting question that to see these, like how these ethnicity is perceived within Japanese, even if their origin is from Japanese, how they are being perceived is a kind of interesting separate question we could explore in the future. Yeah, thanks. And Fan, do you have any comments or anything on this? I know if you don't have to, it's fine.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for the comments and suggestions. We really are going to take them into consideration in the next draft of the paper. And also my mind is moving a little slow right now because it's 4 a.m. But I will go back to a previous comment on whether Japanese who are educated in Western countries respond to education in a different way than Japanese in Japan. I believe that was Brian's question. So, and I'm going to speak of this in the American context. I mean, there's a difference, and I know Gento mentioned it in terms of Japanese international students. His impression is that they don't get changed, their liberal views, their ideology don't change much in the 4 to 5 years that they spend in America as international students. But that's a very different case when they are American-born Japanese, where their experience, where they are the foreigner in America. And Japanese Americans have an experience and a history of marginalization in the US. as internees and as targets of discrimination. So in that case, for American-born Japanese students, their experience of immigration and their attitudes towards foreigners is shaped not only by university education, but also by their experience as targets of discrimination in America. Where they're the target group. And that's a very different situation where in Japan, they are the majority group. So it's not just university, it's just an entire historical experience that's different.
I want to follow up with that question. I guess what I was getting at by this is if you have Japanese-born students who are studying in the West and their attitudes are not being affected by the Western education, then that would suggest that something other than education is at work, some other antecedent set of values and variables that it wouldn't matter if Western education can't influence, which is supposedly a predictor of immigration attitudes, then why should we expect Japanese educational institutes to influence Japanese-born students? So I guess that was the idea that I was pushing. But I take your point about Japanese diaspora. They're going to be probably exposed to a different set of values.
Yeah, I mean, I think my comment was that I don't really know about like Western university education, especially as an exchange student, going to affect their attitude or not. I don't really know too much cases of like Japanese educated high school students attending Western universities for like 4 or 5 years. Many of the Japanese students may spend a year as an exchange student in the Western universities, but that doesn't mean they have experienced the entire course of Western education. So yeah, like I feel like this is still an open question, whether this university experience itself. If what we're saying is right about like Western university education is very different from Japanese education, and that changes the experiments, that changes the results. Yeah, well, I think you're right that what we should expect is that if Western educated Japanese high school graduates should change their attitude in a way that to liberalize their attitude towards immigrants. And I think you're right, and we do want to test that, but yeah, that's probably difficult to test that immediately, and we don't really have the available data to our knowledge. So if anybody knows if there's such data, we're more than happy. We're really excited to test that thesis. So let us know.
Is it okay if I just turn on my microphone and ask a question?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so probably a lot of you don't know me. I'm from our sociology and anthropology department, and I'm an anthropologist who studies population issues in Japan more broadly, more specifically looking at stuff like matchmaking and online dating, which is why I'm here, because I'm interested, like I said, in population issues in Japan more broadly. But as somebody who's also worked to some extent in the Japanese university system, I'm wondering if there isn't something also to be said about the imagined role of universities in society here. It's very much a cliche that Japanese high school students work really hard to get into a good high school, and they work really hard to get into college, and once they're there, they just sort of coast, because getting into college is the more important thing, and what your grades are, and like that is actually not super important as far as getting a job. And at least in my experience, I worked as a lecturer at 3 different universities in Japan, and they had different university cultures, and some students were definitely more high achieving than others, but I found that students were pretty open about university as a stamp of approval for a white collar job in future. And a lot of students were there to like pass, but not necessarily do well. And in addition to perhaps the different makeup of the professoriate in Japan, I also wonder if just students are there for different reasons. That in the US, there's a lot of lip service to this idea of education as a liberalizing and humanizing force, and that you go to college to like find yourself and figure out what you want to do with your life, and your professors are mentors. And in Japan, you know, all of my fourth year students were always like, okay, I have to miss class on these days because there's shushaku katsudo, and you know, I have to job hunt, so bye. So I just wonder if even in the US, even when Japanese students go to the US, they're just imagining the function of a university really differently.
Thank you, Erica. That's a great point, and I completely agree with you that this role, the expected role of university in a society might be very different in Japan and in Western countries. That it is very true that Japanese students tend to see the university as a kind of tool to get a job, and you just need a degree, and you don't really because the Japanese company doesn't consider your grades when they are kind of interviewing them. So unless you're going to graduate school or something, no Japanese student care about the grades. They just want to pass the class. That's exactly as you said. And so in general, like Japanese students may not be too committed to classes or education in university compared to Western countries, and that might explain the results that these these idea passing kind of mechanism doesn't work in Japanese university. And I think I feel like that's a very great framing that we can use to kind of differential role of university in Japan and other countries, in Western countries. And thank you for the comment. And I really, I do agree with you. I was educated in Japanese university until my undergrad, and went to the US graduate school. So I kind of see, I do really see the differences into different types of institutions. Thank you.
Thank you for this really, really great talk, and I hope we can talk more at some point in future about Japan stuff.
Sure, like yeah, I'm actually staying in Japan until probably this semester, until the end of the semester. But if I get in there, I'm more than happy to talk to you and discuss more about these issues. Thank you. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Any other questions or comments? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I'm happy to make another comment because I have a whole bunch of them. So one thing was about sort of about the fact that most of your variables are conceptualized in a dichotomous way. Like, are you losing nuance because of the way that you're constructing your variables? That's one question. And the second question is, I'm wondering if gender is really a good well, I mean, you're using gender for a couple of different things, and I'm wondering actually if gender has an independent effect, because you're using it as a proxy for field of study. But I wonder if that, like in a lot of studies, like we're using gender as an potentially independent effect. And so I'm wondering if you can, I don't know, if you can kind of defend that choice. Not that you have to defend it, right? I'm not, but I'm just like, does it make good sense to really to have gender be doing this double duty? And can we extract out the kind of the effects of field of study versus gender?
Yeah, I think it's just saying it's true that gender should have the infinite effect on attitudes. And while it's not kind of central to our question in terms of like we try to use gender as a kind of conditioning variable in affecting in explaining the effect sizes of different factors. It is more complex than you thought about, like the gender's effect on immigration attitudes in Japan. That female, like in here, like we argue that the female has, like the education's effect is bigger for the female. But on average, in Japan, we kind of saw that the female tend to have a lower support of these integration attitudes compared to male, potentially for different reasons. Maybe that's because of kind of, how to say, lower economic connection with the foreign countries in general. For example, that many of the Japanese, so it's a gender role occupation kind of thing is still like they're strong in Japan, and many Japanese women are housewives where they don't really have idea of foreigners, or they don't have connection with the foreigners in their daily lives. So that's a potential reason that they have a lower support. And that's also a potential reason why education has a stronger role, because nothing other than education can change their attitude in some sense. For males working in like companies and other contexts, they may have other kind of sources of opinion formation and education to make their attitude changeable or crystallized or whichever way. That's kind of our other things. Like I think you're right about like gender do have some independent effect on the immigration attitudes, but that's kind of another complex, interesting question that we can ask, but we can kind of didn't include it as a central point in our paper. Did you ask another thing? I think, yeah. Hope
I asked about like the dichotomizing your variables. So right, like if you're talking about, so like if either you agree that immigrants should have, I mean you do this with all of your variables, but like that, like in certain cases there's a different effect of neither, then disagree,
sure.
Right?
We actually did the robustness check using all the categories in outcomes, and what we find is actually these contrasts, agree versus neither disagree, makes the most important implications rather than other splits. For example, like education does not have an effect to opinionate people in a negative way, for example, from neither to disagree. So it is entirely possible that education makes people more opinionized rather than make them agree more, so that it's possible that they propose ways that they are more likely to be agree or disagree compared to neither. We tested statistics, but we didn't find evidence that they become more disagree rather than neither, but we find evidence that they become more agree than neither, which means that, it's kind of, I want to argue that we didn't really lose that much information by dichotomizing variable, and we verified that with the robustness checks in appendix.
So I just want to build on Gento's point about how most Japanese females don't have much interaction with foreigners in general. There may be something unique or special about Japanese females who do go through the trouble of going to university. Because when we look at the raw education data, most Japanese females attend vocational or 2-year schools. Most of them do not attend universities. So the fact that we are looking at Japanese females who actually went to university, we're looking at a select group of, we may be looking at a select type of Japanese females. And by matching these select group of Japanese females with Japanese females who did not go to university, in that sense, we've tried, at least methodologically, to parse out the independent effects of gender. But in an extension of the paper, we will also need to actually look at do the Japanese females really enroll, are they more likely to enroll in these humanities and social studies programs? We don't have the actual enrollment data. But at least with Gento's technical prowess, we've managed to match these special Japanese female graduates with non-female graduates. You know, it's more to be done there.
Have you guys seen the recent, there was a 2019, there was some Pew reporting on attitudes in Japan towards immigration. Did you guys see this? It said that there was a surprisingly high percentage, more than was expected, something like 23 or up to 25% of the population had supported, which was seemed to be an important shift. So if attitudes among the general population are surging, you know, what other sources might there be besides education or the university? So if attitudes are changing, you know, and the university isn't that source, what is that mechanism? I guess that's not your paper, but it's interesting to identify what that would be.
Yeah.
So you report, like, what kind of question are you talking about? 23% support? Is it about the local suffrage, or is it about like admission of foreigners in general?
So yeah, let's see here. When was it? I'm looking at the Pew reporting. It's the question: in your opinion, should we allow more immigrants to move to our country? And Japan reported 23% were in favor of that proposition. So
yeah, so that's kind of a separate question we wanted to ask, and we kind of eliminate from the paper. But it is true that there's a rising support for admitting more immigrants to Japan in recent days, and but our kind of argument is that this is not actually, it's not exactly correlated with the support for integrating these immigrants as part of the society. So one of the reasons why we have a rising kind of support for these accepting immigrants or admitting immigrants into the country is that economic decline and also the population decline in the country that's becoming a large issue these days. So most of these like industries are suffering, especially in it's like blue collar industries and also like agriculture, fishery. These industries are suffering of these human resources these days. So they are kind of they are in an emergent like immediate need of these foreigners to support these industries, and that's definitely a reason why many more Japanese people are supporting for admitting more foreigners into the country, and Japanese government are pushing that way. So there's a real threat of like as an industry or economy of scarce of the human resources. But interestingly, these kind of wave of like accepting immigrants does not come with like accepting that giving them more rights to be a part of the society. That's not coming yet. That's not really discussed too much yet in Japan, and that's what we are kind of want to get at in a paper.
Mm.
Yeah, and education being a driving force or not in terms of both attitudes is an interesting question. We didn't really have a data for immigration admission for our data set. So we wanted to test that, but we couldn't. But we find some with the smaller data set, we did see an evidence that education do increase the attitude to accept admitting immigrants. So they actually increase the support for admitting immigrants, but they do not increase support for integrating them in some sense.
all right, any other comments? Well, we are getting, I guess we still have 10 minutes technically left, but if anyone else wants to say anything, now's your chance. All right. So I guess everyone has commented out. Thank you, Gento and Fan, for presenting this this really nice paper. We wish you all the best luck in getting this published or future outlets for it. We look forward to having our next guest next week, and I've forgotten to write down who it is, but I'll be sending out an email announcement of our next speaker, which will be next month. I guess that's about it. Thank you guys for attending, and again, thanks to our speakers. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Paul.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.